Thank you all so much for being here tonight. It's a pleasure to be here in Indonesia for this visit. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. All right. There we go. All right, so I do research on money and happiness and how we can turn one into the other. And by the end of today's talk, I do want to try to convince you that people who think money can't buy happiness might not be spending it right. But before we get there, let me tell you how I became so fascinated by this topic. So I somehow managed to make it through my mid-20s without ever holding a real job. I taught water skiing lessons at a summer camp, and I earned a small graduate stipend as a PhD student in psychology. So when I found myself at the age of 26 with my first real grown-up job, my first real salary, I wondered what to do with my newfound wealth. Now, being a nerdy new PhD, I turned to the scientific literature on happiness. There, I found about 1,000 studies documenting the overall relationship between income and happiness. Now, briefly put, what this massive literature shows is that it is better to have more money than to have less. So rich people are happier than poorer people. But not by all that much. In fact, in the United States, once people are making about $75,000 a year, additional income ceases to have any bearing whatsoever on how much people laugh or smile on a given day. And in fact, this basic idea holds up even when you look at the upper end of the income distribution. So my collaborator at Harvard Business School recently asked over 2,000 millionaires, people with over $1 million US of net worth, to rate their general level of happiness on a scale from 1 to 10. Now, according to traditional economic thought, we should see substantial increases in net worth translating into at least some measurable increases in well-being. So the results should look like this. But in fact, this is not what the data showed. Instead, the results looked like that. People with $5 to $10 million of net worth were actually no happier than those with $1 to $2 million of net worth. Now, I should say people with over $10 million of net worth were a smidge happier, but again, this was a surprisingly small effect. So maybe our grandmothers were right. Maybe money just can't buy happiness or the other truly important things in life. Or maybe people aren't spending their money right. Now, to be clear, people have no shortage of ideas about how to use money in order to increase their happiness. So, for example, when CNN ran a story covering some of my research entitled, "Winning the Lottery, Does It Guarantee Happiness?" readers jumped in and spontaneously offered their own plans for what they would do if they won the lottery. So, for example, one person wrote, "If I won the lottery, I would take it upon myself to try and teach people the value of money. For example, I would walk up to people on the street and hand them a couple $100 and say, 'Here, you want this?' When they reached for it, I would yank it back and be like, 'Yeah, right, what are you, crazy? You think people just wake up and get handed huge sums of money?' Of course, I wouldn't tell them that I won the lottery because that kind of defeats the lesson I'm trying to convey." Another wrote, "I would fill a big bathtub with money and get in the tub while smoking a big fat cigar and sipping a glass of champagne. Then I'd have a picture taken and dozens of 8x10 glossies made. Anyone begging for money or trying to extort from me would receive a copy of the picture and nothing else. One more. When I win, I'm going to buy my own little mountain and have a little house on top. So we see these would-be lottery winners saying that if they suddenly came into a lot of money, they would use it to buy stuff, lots of stuff, for themselves and themselves alone. But ironically, a decade of scientific research suggests that people should do the complete opposite in order to get the most happiness out of their money. So in today's talk, I'm going to try and distill that decade of scientific research for you into 5 principles of happy money. Together with my co-author, Mike Norton, at Harvard Business School, I combed through the scientific literature and conducted experiments to try to figure out how people can get the most happiness from every single cent they spend. Now, of course, most of the research that I'll be describing today has been conducted in North America or in Europe, but I'll be very interested in the question and answer period to discuss with you how we might think about whether these ideas can be applied in the cultural context of Indonesia. All right, so let's turn to our first principle, which is buy experiences. So let's say you're talking to a friend who has made a very wise investment and they've come out with a good substantial chunk of money that they're considering using to upgrade from their current home to a bigger, better home. Sounds reasonable. But then they confess to you that there's also something else they're thinking about using this money for. They tell you they're thinking about using this money to buy a ticket to space on Virgin Galactic, which is now pre-selling tickets for the first commercial space flights. Now, I think most sane financial planners would probably recommend investing in that bigger, better home over the ticket to space. But surprisingly, research on happiness points to the opposite conclusion. Study after study shows that people get more happiness from buying experiences like trips and special meals than from buying material things like leather couches and fancy cars, and even houses. But before I try to convince you that that ticket to space might be a pretty good use of the money, let me first try to persuade you that buying the bigger, better home might not be such a great investment in happiness. So I first got interested in this idea as an undergraduate at Harvard. Students at Harvard are randomly assigned at the end of their first year of school to spend the rest of university living in one of 12 different dormitories or houses. Now, some of the houses, like this one, are very beautiful and centrally located. They even have nice water views. Others, like this one, will never grace the cover of a Harvard brochure. Oops. Now, students care a lot about what house they get assigned to. If you ever happen to visit Boston the night before Harvard hands out its housing assignments, you might even spot Harvard freshmen standing on the stately bridges overlooking the Charles River, offering up quiet prayers or even small sacrifices to the housing gods in the hopes of getting assigned to one of those highly desirable houses. And yet, as a student at Harvard myself, I started to wonder if housing really made as much of a difference for students' happiness as they seem to think. So I started tracking students' happiness year after year. What I found was that students who were assigned to those highly undesirable houses expected to be kind of miserable there, but they actually ended up being just as happy as students assigned to the most desirable houses. So this suggests that living in a big, beautiful home might not matter as much for happiness as we think. Of course, I realize Harvard is not perfectly representative of the whole world, but studies from elsewhere in the world are increasingly pointing to the same conclusion. So for example, researchers in Germany recently tracked the happiness of thousands of people who moved to a new home because there was something about their old home that they didn't like. Now, at first glance, it looks like moving worked out pretty well for these people. In the years after they moved, their satisfaction with their housing went up significantly. But over the same time period, their satisfaction with their lives didn't budge. Now, in a very different cultural context of Midwestern America, researchers looked at 600 women who either were homeowners or renters. Now, in Middle America, owning a home is a central component of the American dream. And yet, after taking into account variables like income, the researchers found that homeowners were no happier than renters, although they were about 12 pounds heavier on average. So if buying that bigger, better home isn't such a great investment in our happiness, let's take a second look at that ticket to space. Now, if you happen to visit Virgin Galactic's website, you'll see lots of beautiful pictures, futuristic images of the Earth from space. But the cover of their brochure is a simple gray, adorned only with the words of Mark Twain. 20 years from now, you will be more disappointed by the things you didn't do than by the ones you did do. Now, let's be honest. This is clever marketing. If you want people to pay $250,000 for something like space travel that isn't quite working yet, you better convince them that they won't regret it. But this also turns out to be true. When people are asked to look back on their past spending decisions, their biggest regrets have to do with the experiences they didn't buy, like not paying the extra money to go see Machu Picchu on a business trip to Peru. In contrast, when it comes to material things, just the opposite is true. With material things, people regret what they did buy. Now, the trouble with material things is that they are easy to compare. So my iPhone 5S seems really great until I see your iPhone 6. In contrast, experiences feel unique. It's not so easy to compare my European road trip with your African safari, and that can help to protect both of us against buyer's remorse. Now, just to be clear, I am not saying that we never regret buying experiences. So my worst vacation ever was a trip to Hawaii. I was surfing on this beach on the north shore of Oahu early one morning when I felt a big bump under my board. At first, I figured it was just a big turtle, but then I felt sharp teeth sinking into my leg and saw a big fin cruise past my face. Now, this 10-foot shark circled me for a while. It finally left me alone. I still have my leg, but hands down, worst vacation ever. But at least it makes a good story. It was certainly unique, and in fact, that turns out to be a big reason why experiences provide more happiness than material things. Experiences make better stories. In fact, you will be liked better by the other people in this room right now if you talk to them about your experiential purchases than if you talk to them about your material purchases. Now, shark attacks aside, the ultimate story would have to be a trip to space. This is Marcia Fiamengo and her husband, John. When they were young, after they got married, they started talking about buying tickets to space someday. But as a young couple, that six-figure price tag was out of their reach. And then suddenly everything changed. John became terribly ill and passed away, leaving Marcia a young widow. Now, when the life insurance money came in, Marcia just put it away while she grieved for her husband. But then one day it hit her. What better way to use this money and to honor John's memory than for her to go into space? Now, she won't be going with John as they dreamed, but she told me that her friends and her family have been so involved in all of the planning that she feels like she's got this whole group of people going with her. And that turns out to be the biggest reason why experiences provide more happiness than material things. Experiences tend to be social, connecting us with the people that we care about, whereas material things are often enjoyed alone. So putting this all together, what we're seeing is that experiences provide more happiness than material things because experiences tend to be social, they feel unique, and they tend to be memorable, filling our lives with fond memories. So what this tells us then is that if you have the opportunity to buy an experience that offers these three ingredients, that might be a pretty good investment in your happiness. Now that said, of course, people differ in the extent to which they want each one of those three ingredients. So to illustrate, I'm going to give you a choice between two vacations. So let's say that in January, I could send you to this beautiful beachfront Marriott, or I could send you to Canada's ice hotel, where visitors sleep on beds carved out of ice in ambient temperatures just below freezing. So you can think which one you would choose. Now, whatever you chose, I think most of us would probably agree that that beach vacation might be more pleasant than the ice hotel. But the ice hotel would probably be more memorable, contributing to your experiential CV, your collection of novel, memorable experiences that make up your life story. Now, if the person next to you right now happens to be wearing a wristwatch, you can take a look at their watch and get a pretty good guess as to which of these two vacations they would choose. It turns out that people who set their watches a little bit fast tend to want to make the most of every moment. So they'll take advantage of the opportunity to go see the ice hotel, thereby building their experiential CV even while they're on vacation. In contrast, people who set their watches a little bit slow overwhelmingly prefer the beach hotel. Now, throughout this whole discussion of the superiority of experiential purchases, some of you might have been thinking about an important objection. I first ran into this objection when my book came out in the United Kingdom. I was speaking to a British journalist who insisted that her best purchase ever was a red couch. She readily admitted that this couch did not provide the same intense pleasure as, say, an African safari, but she told me that she got this little bit of pleasure every time she sat down into its soft cushions. And I actually had to admit that most of the research that had been conducted might have missed those sort of low-level but frequent experiences of pleasure. So to examine this problem, we conducted another study over Christmas in Canada. So on Christmas morning, we sent people a text message, and we continued to text them 3 times a day for 2 weeks. Now, on Christmas Day, we asked them to pick out a particular gift that they had received, and every time we texted them, we asked them how much that gift was contributing to their happiness right in that moment. Now, we asked some people to tell us about a material gift they had received, like pajamas or perfume. We asked other people to tell us about an experiential gift they had received, like, say, a spa day or tickets to a sporting event. Now, indeed, we found that people who got material gifts experienced more frequent happiness from those gifts. But people who got experiential gifts got a more intense burst of happiness. So this suggests that you could think of material purchases and experiential purchases as kind of providing two different flavors of happiness. If you like that low intensity but frequent flavor of happiness, you might like a material purchase. But if you prefer that more intense burst of flavor, you might prefer the experiential purchase. However, the story doesn't end there. We also followed up with people 6 weeks after Christmas. We found that 6 weeks after Christmas, people's satisfaction with their experiential gifts grew significantly. So by 6 weeks after Christmas, people felt better about their experiential gifts than about their material gifts, suggesting that the kind of emotional return on investment actually grows over time when we buy experiences. Now, I put this idea to work in my own life. When I was working on my book, I traveled to Bali, to Nusa Lembagan, and I actually wrote the second chapter of my book, Make It a Treat, in Nusa Lembagan. So let's turn now to that second principle, second chapter, which is Make It a Treat. Oops. So if I could summarize for you all of the research on happiness in just 3 words, it might be these 3 words. Abundance undermines appreciation. The more we have of something, the less we tend to appreciate it. And actually, this helps to explain why that relationship between money and happiness is relatively weak. On the one hand, money gives us access to all kinds of wonderful things. But at the very same time, money can actually undermine our ability to appreciate those things. Now, this helps to explain a puzzling finding about luxury cars. Let's see if you could get there. There we go. All right. So I think most of us can probably agree that it should be more enjoyable to drive a luxury car than a more basic economy model. And yet, when researchers surveyed drivers, they found that the value of their cars had no bearing whatsoever on how much people reported enjoying their most recent drive. So how could this be? Clearly, driving a BMW should be more fun than driving a very basic minivan. But the problem with our cars is that we have them all the time. So the features that captivated our attention during the test drive just kind of fade into the background when we're rushing to work in the morning. I should say there was one exception to this rule. When people took their cars out on joyrides, when they drove just for the pleasure of driving, they did get more pleasure from driving luxury cars. Now, this basic idea extends all the way from luxury cars to chocolate bars. So in a recent study, we brought students into our lab and asked them to eat some chocolate. Then we politely asked one group of people to please refrain from eating any chocolate for a whole week. Meanwhile, we sent another group of students home with a big bag of chocolate and told them to eat as much as they comfortably could over the ensuing week. Now, at first glance, the people who left our lab with that big bag of chocolate seemed like the lucky ones. But in fact, they paid a price for this abundance. When they returned to our lab the following week to eat some more chocolate, they enjoyed it significantly less than they had the week before. In fact, the only people who enjoyed the chocolate as much the second week as they had the first were those who had given it up in between. Now, I like this study because it points to a simple way that we can potentially increase our happiness while spending less money. Now, to illustrate this idea, I need to tell you guys about an addiction that I developed. So I live in Vancouver, Canada, where kale, a sort of spinach-like vegetable, is very popular. And several years ago, I became addicted to this kale smoothie. Now, this kale smoothie, it's very healthy, but it's also surprisingly expensive. At $8 a pop, it's pretty much the most expensive way you could eat kale. Now, at first, I really enjoyed drinking these kale smoothies, but soon I was just sucking them down after work without really noticing. So I decided to give up these smoothies for a while, get my greens in a cheaper way, and now when I occasionally treat myself to one of these smoothies, I really appreciate it again. So I would suggest then that if there's something that you started out buying for pleasure that you no longer really notice, then taking a break from that thing might be a good way to reduce your spending while increasing your happiness. Now, of course, it's easy to take a break from a smoothie, but there are lots of things in life that it's not so easy to take a break from, like, say, our spouses. So join me, if you will, on a brief detour into love. Now, when I was in graduate school, I noticed something kind of puzzling about the behavior of my longtime boyfriend, Benjamin. When Benjamin was in a little bit of a bad mood, he would act cranky around me, knowing that I, as his longtime girlfriend, would put up with his bad mood. But if we happened to run into a stranger or casual acquaintance, Benjamin would perk right up, acting pleasant and cheerful as social norms demand. And most annoyingly, his own positive behavior around strangers would often get him out of his bad mood. Now, one of the really fun things about being a behavioral scientist is that when your boyfriend does something annoying, you can bring in hundreds of research participants and try to get to the bottom of it. So I brought in lots of romantic couples. I'd bring in 2 romantic couples at a time, and I randomly assigned each person to interact either with their own romantic partner or with an opposite-sex stranger from one of the other couples. Now, just like Benjamin, people acted perky and pleasant around people they had never met, and this provided benefits for their own mood that they failed to foresee. Now, I didn't want to give up on romantic relationships, so I decided to conduct another experiment. I brought in more romantic couples, but this time I asked everybody to interact with their own romantic partner. But I told half the people to try to be their best selves, to act like they would around someone they had just met or someone they had just started dating. What I found was that people got a significantly bigger boost from interacting with their significant other when they treated the love of their lives like a stranger. Now, I realize that it would be awkward to go home from this conference and tell your spouse that you are going to treat them like a stranger. But fortunately, there are other ways to inject a feeling of novelty back into our long-term relationships. So research shows that just doing novel, exciting activities with your romantic partner, like going on a hot air balloon ride together, can actually make the relationship itself feel exciting again. And this is important because it turns out that boredom is a very powerful force. In fact, this is true even in the animal kingdom. So bulls get bored with the artificial mating devices that farmers use to extract their semen. But just moving that artificial mating device to a new location can successfully renew bulls' interest. Now, this basic idea works in human relationships as well. It turns out, at least based on data in North America, that your current level of boredom with your romantic partner is likely to predict your satisfaction with that relationship 10 years from now. So maybe it's true that money can't buy love, but it can buy hot air balloon rides and other novel, exciting activities. All right, so let's turn now to our third principle, which is buy time. Now, the really great thing about money is that it should give us more control over the way we use our time. And yet, remarkably, it turns out that wealthier individuals do not use their time in happier ways on a day-to-day basis. In fact, they actually spend more time working, commuting, and shopping, 3 activities that are associated with relatively low levels of happiness. Now, to try to quantify this seemingly squishy dimension of day-to-day happiness, researchers have developed what's called the U index. The U index refers to the amount of time an individual spends in a bad mood on an average day. So this is when your feelings of tension, irritation, and depression outweigh your feelings of happiness. Now, this is a graph for North America. In North America, we've seen income levels rise fairly substantially over the past 5 decades, but in the same period of time, the U index has barely budged. And I think this is an important lesson for the rest of the world as we face potentially rising incomes. Oops. So what I would suggest is that if you're facing a difficult financial decision, it's worth pausing to ask yourself, how will the trade-offs that you're contemplating influence the U index? Now, for most people, we could improve the U index by spending more time with loved ones and less time working and commuting. Now, commuting in particular is interesting. It turns out to be a big negative weight on people's happiness. Now, in the United States, it turns out the typical American actually spends 2 weeks a year commuting, which is more than the typical American spends taking vacation. And research in Germany suggests that adding a 1-hour commute to your day is similar to becoming unemployed in terms of the negative toll it takes on happiness. So, for example, it may be a good investment in our happiness to move somewhere that doesn't require us to spend a huge amount of our day sitting in traffic. Now, considering these sorts of trade-offs may be particularly important as people climb the income ladder. The more financially prosperous individuals become, the more likely they are to experience a sense of time famine, of being constantly pressed for time. In fact, just making people feel like their time is worth a lot of money is enough to create this sense of time famine. So, for example, in one study, researchers asked a group of students to play the role of consultants. These students were asked to do a variety of tasks and to charge out at a rate of 15 cents a minute to another company. Now, this works out to $9 an hour in Canadian dollars, which is, even for students, a pretty low rate. In contrast, other students were asked to do those same set of tasks for the same amount of time, but they were told to charge at a rate of $1.50 a minute, which works out to a pretty good rate of $90 an hour. Now, even though all the students were told to do the same stuff for the same amount of time, the students whose time was worth $90 an hour ended up feeling significantly more pressed for time. In other words, just making students' time worth a lot of money was enough to make them feel like time-squeezed, stressed-out consultants. So why would this possibly be? Well, we all know that when a resource is scarce, it tends to be perceived as valuable. So you can think of diamonds or drinking water in the desert. But this is such a powerful association that we also perceive the opposite to be true. So when something is valuable, we tend to perceive it as scarce. So when your time is worth a lot of money, you're more likely to feel as though you don't have enough of it. So recognizing this sort of trade-off between material affluence and time affluence, researchers have begun to measure both types of wealth. So for example, we asked people to rate their their agreement with statements like, I've had enough money to buy the things that are important to me. This captures material affluence. But we also asked them to rate their agreement with statements like, I've had enough time to do the things that are important to me, capturing their sense of time affluence. And this matters because time affluence is associated with greater happiness, better health, and more job satisfaction. Now, of course, time affluence might seem like an elusive goal, but I would suggest that we can potentially increase our feelings of time affluence by looking to eliminate the activities that we truly dread. So for me, cleaning my house is like the bane of my existence. So after our son was born, my husband and I finally hired somebody to help us with this. And meanwhile, in my research lab, what I'm finding is that people who use their money to buy better time turn out to be happier. And yet, relatively few people report in North America using their money in that way. And we find this effect even though when we ask people, can you think of a task that you'd like to pay somebody else to do? 99% of people tell us, yep, they can think of something, with cleaning being number one. And yet we don't see people doing very much of this in North America. And so we're currently trying to understand the mental barriers that may prevent people from using their money to buy better time. Now, it turns out that creative employers are finding ways to utilize these ideas. So, for example, Stanford University recently created a kind of time bank for the stressed out physicians in its Department of Emergency Medicine. Now, of course, these physicians, their main job is to take care of their patients, but they're also frequently asked to do various kinds of service, like, say, mentoring a younger colleague or serving on a committee. Now, these forms of service often go unrecognized and unappreciated. So what Stanford did was to start rewarding its employees with time credits, so providing them with meal delivery, house cleaning, and other kinds of services to save them time. And this program seems to be increasing people's job satisfaction and job performance. And we're currently working with the White House Social and Behavioral Sciences team to see if we can expand this idea to provide government workers in the United States with rewards not only in the form of money, but in the form of time. Now, of course, individuals differ in the extent to which they want money versus time. So to get at these individual differences, we created a simple measure. So I'd invite you to try this right now. I just want you to decide which of two women is more similar to you. So are you more similar to Tina? Tina values her time more than her money. She's willing to sacrifice her money to have more time. For example, Tina would rather work fewer hours and make less money than work more hours and make more money. Now, for comparison, we have Maggie. Maggie values her money more than her time. She's willing to sacrifice her time to have more money. She'd rather work more hours and make more money than work fewer hours and have more time. So just give you a moment to think which of these women is more similar to you. You a Tina or a Maggie? Well, it turns out that the Tinas are happier. In North America, we find that the population of Canada and the United States is pretty much 50-50. 50% Tinas, 50% Maggies, but the Tinas are happier. All right, so let's turn now to our fourth principle, which is pay now, consume later. Now, pretty much everything about modern society pushes us to consume right now and often pay for it later. So I can walk into a store, buy a great new pair of shoes, pay with a credit card, and my future self will have to deal with the bill. But happiness research suggests we should do the complete opposite in order to get the most happiness from our money. We should pay right now and delay consumption. So for example, if you're going to take a vacation several months from now, you should pay for it now and then wait and take that vacation in a few months. Now understand this idea. Let's look at the costs that arise when people delay payment. So in one of my favorite studies, a professor gave his students the opportunity to bid on tickets to a sold-out sporting event. Now, he told some of the students that they would have to pay for these tickets with cash the very next day in class. Meanwhile, he told other students that they could pay with a credit card, thereby pushing payment into the indefinite future. Now, I will tell you that when the students had to pay with cash the next day, they bid an average of $28 for these tickets. I'm going to give you a moment now, though, and I want you to try and guess. You can talk to the people around you. I want you to try and guess how much do you think people bid on average when they could pay with a credit card. So again, when people had to pay with cash, they were bidding $28. Oops, oh, I just gave away the answer. Damn. All right, I'll tell you the answer then. This clicker. All right, so on average, people were bidding about $60 when they had to pay with a credit card. Now, you might wonder, well, who were these students in this study? Maybe they were financially naive freshmen, first-year students at a university. But no, in fact, they were top students, MBA students, business school students at one of the top universities in North America. And yet, they paid a 100% premium for the opportunity to use a credit card. So the idea here is that when we push payment into the future, it kind of dulls our memory and our representation of how much we're actually spending. So let's play another one. This time I will not show the answer. So in this study, 30 people were asked to guess the size of their credit card bill right before they opened it. So I'll give you a moment. You can talk to people around you. And I want you to try to guess, out of the 30, how many people do you think underestimated the size of their bill? So you guys talk to those around you. All right, let's hear. Anyone you want to yell out an answer? 25. So the answer is all 30 by an average of about 30%. So people were significantly underestimating how much they had spent. And the idea here is that basically credit cards can make it hard to remember how much we've actually spent, making it really easy to rack up debt. And this is important from a happiness perspective because more debt is associated with a lot of emotional issues, including more marital conflict. And not just about money. Couples who have more debt have more conflict about everything from sex to in-laws. Now, of course, savings matter too, but it turns out that the emotional benefits of paying off debt actually dwarf the benefits of saving. So if you have a lot of debt, the best thing you could do for your happiness is probably to pay it off. Now, fortunately, the way that we handle our money, simple changes in how we operate our financial lives, can make a big difference in the likelihood that we'll rack up debt. In fact, international data suggests that people who use debit cards have 400% less debt compared to people who do not use debit cards. Now, just to take you guys a little bit deeper into the underlying psychology, let me tell you how neuroscientists have approached this issue. So, economists have long talked about the sort of pain of paying, that twinge of discomfort that we feel when we hand over our hard-earned cash. But neuroscientists have recently discovered that when people face high prices for the things that they want, they actually exhibit activation in a region of the brain called the insula, which is associated with experiencing real, physical, stub-your-toe style pain. In fact, when people are asked to look back on their recent expenditures, what money they've spent recently, they become more sensitive to physical pain. So what this is telling us is that paying for something actually has a lot in common with real physical pain. And remember, pain is a good thing. Pain is healthy. Pain tells us when we're getting ourselves into trouble. Credit cards protect us from this pain, but in a way that sort of undoes this healthy system. And so we can harness the pain of paying by paying upfront in cash, thereby putting the brakes on spending and preventing us from racking up too much debt. Of course, if you're going to pay right now, you don't want that pain of paying to drag down the pleasure of consuming. So for example, if you're going to pay for a vacation right now, it's better if you take that vacation later. And doing so can actually make consumption feel free. So I put this strategy into practice when I was planning my own wedding. My husband and I got married in Mexico, and we had our wedding at an all-inclusive resort. Now, many of our guests stayed at the resort for a whole week, and I really encouraged my guests to pay for their stay at the resort way in advance. Now, I knew that this strategy had worked when I saw my friend Derek sitting by the pool, drinking a mojito and saying, "It's so tasty because it's free." No, it wasn't really free. He had paid for it as part of his resort package. But because he had paid so far in advance, he could enjoy that mojito as though it were free. Now, delaying consumption comes with one last benefit. When we delay consumption, we can actually whet our appetites. So, for example, in one study, researchers asked people to choose between two chocolates, the blue one or the gold one. Which one do you want to eat? And then they either told people, okay, go ahead and eat your chocolate right away, or they told people, you're going to have to wait 30 minutes before you can eat your chocolate. Now, most people said they would rather just go ahead and eat the chocolate right now, thank you very much. But in fact, when students had to wait to eat their chocolate, they ended up enjoying it significantly more. In other words, having to wait for something can actually whet our appetites, both literally and metaphorically, increasing the pleasure of consumption. So putting this all together, what we're seeing is that by paying up front, we can put the brakes on spending, reducing our debt, but of course we still want to separate payment and consumption, so by consuming later, we can make our consumption feel free, as well as capitalizing on those benefits of anticipation. All right, and without further anticipation, let us turn to our very final principle of the night: invest in others. So this is perhaps the most radical idea of the evening. The idea here is that you might actually be happier if you use your money to help other people rather than yourself. Now, we first tested this idea by going out on our beautiful campus at the University of British Columbia, armed with cash. So we walked up to people in the morning and handed them either a $5 or a $20 bill, which we asked them to spend by the end of the day. But there was a catch. We told half the people they had to use this money to benefit others. Meanwhile, we told half the people they had to use this money to benefit themselves. So, what do you think people did with this extra little bit of money in their pockets? Well, when we told people to spend this money on themselves, what we call personal spending, they did things like buying makeup and jewelry and lots of food. In contrast, when we told people to spend the money on others, what we call pro-social spending, they still bought lots of food, but now they shared it with other people. In addition, some people made donations to charity, and one student bought a toy for a younger sibling. Now the question is, which type of spending would leave people happier by the end of the day? Well, when we called people back that night, we found that people who had been assigned to spend this money on others felt significantly happier compared to those assigned to spend this money on themselves. Now, we conducted that first experiment in Vancouver, in Canada, but we've since replicated this basic effect in countries around the world. So, for example, we conducted parallel experiments in both Canada and the East African nation of Uganda. We asked people in both countries to look back and reflect on a time where they had spent their own money either to help themselves or to help somebody else. Now, as you might imagine, the kinds of spending experiences that people described differed quite dramatically between Canada versus Uganda. So, for example, when we asked people to think about a time where they'd spent their own money on somebody else, one person in Canada wrote, "I spent $20 for 2 dozen red roses for my mother's birthday." In contrast, faced with exactly the same instructions, one person in Uganda wrote, "I gave money to a friend to buy medication for his aching ulcers." Now, I have to be honest with you guys, when I was sitting in Uganda, reading through these spending descriptions, I thought to myself, okay, there's no way we're going to replicate in Uganda exactly what we've seen in Canada, because the kinds of spending descriptions that people were providing just seemed so different. And yet, to my surprise, when all the data were in, we saw exactly the same effect in both countries, whereby people in both Canada and Uganda felt happier when they thought about a time where they'd used their own money to benefit somebody else. Now, the fact that we're able to see this warm glow of giving in countries around the world suggests that it might be kind of baked in to human nature. Now, if that's right, it's possible that we could detect a kind of early version of this warm glow of giving, even among very young children. So to look at this possibility, we brought in toddlers just under the age of 2 to our lab. Now, we realize, as of course any parents in this room will recognize, that most children under 2 don't really care that much about money. So we worked with the sort of toddler equivalent of gold, namely little goldfish crackers. These are cheesy crackers that toddlers love. So we provided these children with a windfall of goldfish crackers for themselves, as well as an opportunity to give some of those goldfish crackers away to a puppet named Monkey. So I want to show you now a video of one of the toddlers participating in our study. Oops. Let's go back.
Now I want you to meet my friend Monkey. Hello. Do you want to say hello? Can I have Monkey back? Hello. We're going to play a game. Yeah. Look, Monkey has a bowl just like you. Yeah. But both you and Monkey don't have any treats. Yeah. Oh no, you don't have any treats and neither does Monkey. That's right. But look. I found even more treats, and I'm going to give them all to you. Treats. But, you know, I don't see any more treats. Will you give one to Monkey? Yeah? Yeah. Ooh, yum, 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 yum. Oh,
All right, so what you see is this little girl was pretty happy when she got a windfall of goldfish crackers for herself. She was even happier when she got to give some of those goldfish away to Monkey. Now, when we bring in dozens of toddlers and have their facial expressions objectively coded, this is what we see over and over again. Now, the fact that we're able to see this warm glow of giving in very young children and in countries around the world suggests that it may be a pretty fundamental component of human nature. However, that does not mean that simply lightening your wallet in generous ways will always make you happier. In fact, what our research shows is that there are really 3 critical ingredients: connection, choice, and impact, that at least in North America seem to be very important in turning good deeds into good feelings. So we find that people are more likely to experience joy from giving to others when they feel a really strong sense of social connection with the individuals or the cause that they're helping. We also see that choice matters. It's important that people feel like the decision to give was freely chosen rather than being kind of forced upon them. And finally, it's important that people can see the impact that their generosity is having. So for example, in one study, we gave people the opportunity to make a donation to either UNICEF or Spread the Net. So both of these are worthy charities. They're actually partners, and they share the same important goal of promoting children's health around the world. But I think UNICEF is such a big, broad charity that it can be a bit hard for people to really know what kind of a difference their dollars are making. In contrast, Spread the Net offers its donors a clear, concrete promise. For every $10 donated, Spread the Net will provide 1 bed net to protect a child from malaria. Now, consistent with the idea that impact matters, we saw that the more money people gave to Spread the Net, the better they felt afterward. In contrast, this emotional return on investment was completely eliminated when people gave money to UNICEF. So this suggests then that we're more likely to find joy in giving when we can find opportunities to give that provide these ingredients of connection, choice, and impact. Skip over this example. And this is particularly important because it turns out that the better people feel about a past experience of giving, the more likely they are to choose to give in the future. So there seems to be a kind of virtuous cycle between happiness and giving. Now, in North America, we actually find that the wealthier individuals are, the less they give as a proportion of their incomes. So this suggests then that at least in North America, there's a kind of unrealized opportunity for happiness, whereby people could get more of their happiness by giving more away. And I think people like Warren Buffett are providing a great example of that idea. Now, throughout the talk, I've been focusing on happiness, but I just want to briefly share with you guys some of the newest findings coming out of our lab, showing that spending money on others can also promote job satisfaction and even physical health. So turning to job satisfaction, we actually worked with a large bank in Australia, and we gave a subset of its employees vouchers for a website called Karma Currency. Now, if you have a voucher for Karma Currency, you can go to this website and use your voucher to make a donation to the charity of your choice. What we found was that when people got to donate $100 to the charity of their own personal choice on behalf of the bank that they worked for, they ended up feeling more satisfied with their jobs at the bank. So this suggests that providing people with opportunities for meaningful generosity in the workplace can potentially increase job satisfaction. Now, turning last to physical health, we recently conducted a new study that just came out in which we recruited adults who suffered from high blood pressure. And these adults were all over the age of 65. We gave each one of them $120 to spend over the course of 6 weeks. But you guys might guess by now there was a catch. We told half the people they had to spend this money on others. All of the $120 had to be used to benefit other people. Meanwhile, we told half the people they had to use all this money, all the $120, to benefit themselves. Now, we measured their blood pressure, both before the study began, as well as in the weeks after they spent it. Now, when we told people to spend the money on themselves, they did things like buying a sweater, a massage. One woman bought face cream that she described as being like a miracle. Meanwhile, people in the pro-social spending condition did things like buying muffins for firefighters, making charitable donations, and buying toys for their grandchildren. Now, everybody really liked getting this pile of money to spend, but when we gave them the money and told them to spend it on themselves, we found no change in their blood pressure from the beginning to the end of the study. In contrast, when we gave them the same amount of money and told them to spend it on others, we saw a significant reduction in both their systolic and diastolic blood pressure. And in terms of magnitude, this change in blood pressure was similar to that typically seen when people start engaging in frequent exercise. Now, I want to emphasize this is very new research. Nobody should stop taking their blood pressure medication just because they gave to charity. But it does provide us with some tantalizing evidence that spending money on others may not only be heartwarming, it may also be, quite literally, good for our hearts. So the message that I want to leave you with tonight is if you hear someone say, money can't buy happiness, tell them to try giving some of it away. Thank you.